Welcome to the penultimate lesson of this series on In the Beginning, looking at the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Once again, let's review what we've been looking at in the previous section about Noah. Back in chapter 6, we discovered that humanity had become deeply sinful, even violent, and God regretted creating people. But Noah found favor because he was different. He was a righteous man who walked with God. God instructed him to build a massive ark to survive the coming judgment. In chapter 7, Noah and his family and pairs of every animal, 7 of the pairs of clean animals, entered the ark. And the floodwaters came and prevailed for 150 days, destroying all life on the earth. In chapter 8, we discovered the waters receded and the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. And Noah sent out birds to check for dry land. After almost a year, they left the ark, and Noah built an altar to worship God. In chapter 9, God established a covenant with Noah and with all life on earth, promising never to destroy the earth with a flood again. He gave permission to eat meat to Noah and his descendants. He established laws regarding the sanctity of life, and he put the rainbow in the clouds as a sign of his covenant. We also saw the incident of Noah's drunkenness and his son Ham's sin. This week we'll be looking at chapter 10, which I believe to be a fascinating chapter that looks at what we often call the Table of Nations. It shows how Noah's descendants spread across the ancient world after the flood. We're going to see the genealogies, at least some of the genealogies, of Shem, Ham, and Japheth's families, even looking at some particular people like Nimrod, as well as Peleg. An outline of this section might look something like this. This is how we're going to look at it. First 5 verses talk about the descendants of Japheth. Verses 6 to 20, descendants of Ham, and also an emphasis on Canaan's descendants. And then verses 21 to 32, the descendants of Shem. Now, the genealogies that this chapter deals with may be cities or nations rather than people. Some have suggested. We find in verse 6 Egypt. But these seem to more likely be the founders of these nations. We can find out where at least some of the people today descended from, that is, which son they came from. Now, I realize genealogies tend to not be our favorite reading. These are my ancestors, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-great-grandparents. The lives of these people really wouldn't interest you, but they do me. Now, they're all dead. Everybody in that picture has died. And I've now visited the graves of most of them. Even visited the graves of some of my great-great-great-great-grandparents. Now, for them, I found the graves, but know hardly anything about them except who their child was and where they're buried. I have absolutely no photos of them. But these people interest me because they, in some way, have influenced my life, even though I didn't meet half of them. Their DNA is in me. 5 of these died before I was even born. Jim McGuigan said this about genealogies. He said, genealogies are only dry when they're not our genealogies. Family photos are only boring when they're someone else's. I thought he had a good point there. So let's look at the text of Genesis chapter 10. Now, I'm not going to be reading the text in this lesson simply because it isn't the most exciting of reads, and most likely you trip over some of the names. But I'm going to try to pull out some little nuggets that may be of interest. We find that sons were born to Noah's 3 sons after the flood. Evidently, they did not have any before, or if they did, they drowned in the flood. But notice this chapter begins with what we call back in lesson 1 as a colophon, which probably then should be the conclusion of chapter 9. And these are the chapter 9 and preceding were the records that the sons of Noah kept. This chapter, we'll see at the end of chapter 11 in our next lesson, most likely are the records that Shem kept. This text deals with Japheth and Ham first, gets them out of the way before dealing with Shem, whose descendants are the main characters of the remainder of the book of Genesis. Now, this is not intended to be a complete history, but it is giving the background for Abraham and his descendants. It would also seem that this chapter supposes that what happened in chapter 11 at the Tower of Babel has already happened. Notice that in verse 5, we already have languages and the division of the people. So chapter 11, which we'll look at in our next lesson, may be the explanation of chapter 10, giving the why people separated and where the different languages came from. The only sons listed in this chapter, it's only sons that are listed in this chapter of genealogies. There probably would have been as many daughters born to them as sons, but they're not the ones that are listed in genealogical records as a whole. We find in the first 5 verses that the sons of Japheth are listed. Now, Japheth in Greek is Iapetos. That's where we get the word Jupiter. In fact, that translation is really Jupiter. He has a son named Gomer, and Gomer, I've circled that on the map. I think that his descendants lived in Turkey, eventually became the Celtic peoples, or possibly even the Crimean peoples, or the Cimmerians. His son, Ashkenaz, notice up in that area is where it's supposed, is identified with Germany. German Jews today are called Ashkenazi. Some ethnologists believe that the Scandinavians and the Saxons also came from this son, and possibly the Scythians. By the way, I'm not suggesting that the German Jews came from this. They're not from Japheth, they're from Ham. But that area that they ended up in Germany would have been from this descendants. We have Rephath. Possibly his descendants were the Carpathians. Even a slight possibility that the term Europe is a corruption of his name. We find Togarma. They suggested that the Armenians came from him, those from eastern Turkey and the Turkestan areas. We've got Magog. Now, that name features later on in the book of Ezekiel. Suggested that possibly the Scythians came from his line. At least that's what Josephus records. Possibly those from modern-day Georgia was from his particular line. We have Madai, well, over there on the eastern side. Madai is where the Medes came from, so it's just somewhat east of Syria, and it's eventually the Indian peoples, those from India, hence the arrow going east. And then there's Javan, or Yavan. That's where the Greeks came from. And we have Elisha, and not the same one as the prophet, but his descendants populated Cyprus. We have Tarshish, and some identify these as settling the southern coast of Turkey. Others believe they ended up in Spain, hence the name Tarshish that Jonah tried to flee to. There's the Kittim. They are also associated with Cyprus and Rhodes, and later on the Romans. The Dodanim are associated with Greece. Then we have Tubal, or the Tubals, and they're identified with the Tiberanians and settled north of the Black Sea, possibly the ancestors of some of the Russian peoples today. We have Meshech, Moskians, Russians again, and they're listed in the Assyrian records as Musku. And then finally, we have Tyrus, possibly the Thracians, and later the Etruscans of Italy. But generally, Japheth's descendants, as you can see on the map, lived north and west of Palestine. In other words, in what today is Europe. Now, how do we know which nations came from these sons? Well, archaeology has done much to shed light on this subject. Most scholars, though, regard Genesis 1 to 11, including the dispersal of people throughout the world, as a collection of Middle Eastern myths and fables. There's a man named Bill Cooper. He lived fairly recently. He found himself in a dilemma. He believed in the Bible, and if scholars were right, the Bible had to be wrong. So he set out to put what he could of Genesis 1 to 11 to the test historically. And he decided that he would continue researching until the Bible had been proven to be false. Assumptions weren't good enough. He needed actual data. He concentrated most of his study on chapters 10 and 11 of Genesis, Babel, and the Table of Nations. And his test was very simple. If the names of the individuals and groups of people found here, which we looked for in particular, just finished looking at Japheth's, then we should be able to find them in the secular history of the various nations. Now, he realized that many might not be possible to find due to records perishing. So he decided that if he could find 40% of those names in the histories of those countries, that would validate the Bible. The reality is that in his 25 years of research, he surpassed the 40% mark, moved past the 50% mark, even moved past the 60% mark. In fact, this is what he wrote. This was written in 1995. Today, I can say that the names so far vindicated in the Table of Nations make up over 99% of the list. And I shall make no further comment on that other than to say that no other ancient historical document of purely human authorship could be expected to yield such a level of corroboration as that. And I will add further that modern biblical commentators must make of it what they will. He wrote his findings in a book called After the Flood. That's his picture there on the back cover. You can still get a hold of this book, I believe, from Amazon. As you can see, it's from New Wine Press, and so you might even be able to get a copy from there. For a while, there was a free PDF that you could download. So even if you search for that as a PDF, you might be able to find it. It's a fascinating book. Yes, I have read it. But Bill carried his test even further, as the original documents he researched were from the Middle East, as also is the Bible. So what about the European peoples? In their historical records, do they trace all the way back to Noah's son Japheth? Is what we've just looked at accurate? To make the study accurate, the documents he consulted had to date from before the time any historian gives that Europe was influenced by Christianity. And the reason being, some scholars allege that some of the early monks in the monastic communities forged many of the histories. And this book, After the Flood, is a summary of his search, his research, and his evidence for it. He discovered that Japheth is found in virtually all Indo-European cultures and is regarded as the father of many peoples. The ancient Greeks recorded him as Iapetos. India, he's called Prajapati, Father Japheth. The Romans referred to him as Pater, Pater being father. Father Jove is the way we usually translate that, and Pater obviously became Jupiter. And this is a fresco from Herculaneum that's been discovered of Pater, Zeus, Jupiter, with a thunderbolt and his scepter in the clouds. Eros is looking over his shoulder and pointing at the scepter. But notice as well, included here is a rainbow. I thought that was interesting. But even the early Irish Celts, the early Britons, other pagan European races traced the descent of their royal houses from a man named Japheth, or whatever form of Japheth they had. The Saxons called him Shaph, but they all had different forms, but the name still translates as Japheth. It goes back to Japheth. In fact, what was fascinating to me reading this book is that the Miazo people of China, when the Christian missionaries first encountered them when they were going into China, it was discovered they found this people, the Miazos, that already knew surprisingly accurate details of the creation of the flood. Some of the detail coinciding almost identically with Genesis. Yet they had not had any previous contact with Jews or Christians. They claimed that they were not of Chinese descent, but that they were descended from Japheth, or as they called him, Yafu. They had preserved their ancestry by reciting it faithfully at all funerals, weddings, and other public occasions for as long as they could remember. Of note is that the earliest ancestor's name is translated into English as dirt, which is basically what the Hebrew word also means for Adam. They've recorded that the wife of Noah was Gal Boluan. They record the three sons of Nuah, as they have them, Nuah, as Lohan, Loshin, Yafu. I think we can see that they knew who they were talking about biblically. There were 11 of these tribes, and 5 of them formed the Miazo nation. The other 6 intermarried with other Chinese peoples. But the sons of Japheth, one thing we can find, they're found outside the Bible. They're ingrained into various cultures as well. You know, we sometimes have the impression that people before the Roman and Greek times were ignorant and couldn't write, conveniently forgetting the Egyptians, who could write as well as the Bible itself, plus everything else that we found, the Sanskrit writings and the clay tablets that we have. The history that's taught in this country usually begins about 55 BC with the Romans, as if there were no other records. But quite to the contrary, there are records of the various nations of Europe that vastly predate the coming of the Romans. Bill Cooper wrote this. He said, "Many nations kept an accurate record down the centuries of their beginnings and wrote down the names of their founding patriarchs, bringing the records up to date with the advent of each new generation. And it is these records that provide us with such a surpassing link between the ancient post-flood era depicted in Genesis and the history of more modern times. These lists, annals and chronicles, have been preserved and transmitted from generation to generation, not by the nations of the Middle East this time, but by certain European peoples from times that long predated the coming of Christianity. And it is most important that we remember the pre-Christian Christian aspect of much of the following evidence, for it is too easily and too often alleged by modernist scholars that these records are the inventions of early Christian monks and are therefore worthless. I don't know about you, but as I started reading Bill's book many years ago, I was a bit skeptical about his claims. I'd heard other people make claims that just couldn't be backed up. So the first thing I looked for, especially in this book, was where he found his information. One thing I love about his book, he tells you what documents he used, where he found them. Each fact is documented, so you can go check it out if you wish to make the effort. Now, one of his major sources is a monk named Nennius. The thing about Nennius is that he gathered together as many of the existing records of the Britons that were still around in his day that he could find and compiled them into one book, completing it around the end of the 8th century in the 700s. But he simply transcribed what these other documents said with no attempt at correcting conflicts that he found in the varying accounts. Now, granted, as with any human production, some bits that he recorded are of doubtful quality and reliability. But where they can be cross-checked, in particular with Josephus or with Virgil or some of the other ancient historians, we find them to be very accurate. And Nennius preserved many of the ancient chronicles of the European peoples. The ancient nations kept track of the genealogies of their royal families. That was extremely important to them. And the ones we have, without exception, trace back to Japheth. This is before there could have been any Christian or biblical influence. In other words, there's no reason for them to have made up these genealogies. Anglo-Saxon, British, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandics trace back through Japheth's son Yavin, splitting at Woden. Irish Celts track back to Japheth through his son Magog. Virgil gives a lineage in the Aeneid, which he recorded in Greek, which corresponds to what other ancient records state, going back to Japheth, Jupiter. Most of us, as Europeans, are descended from Japheth. Notice that the NIV says that these became a sailing people. But this list we have in Genesis chapter 10 would have been made after Babel. Each has their own language. By the way, the fresco here of Jupiter is from Pompeii. So very ancient drawings there. The next section, verses 6 down to 20, deals with the descendants of Ham. Notice that he has 4 sons listed here: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. So let's see where they ended up settling. Notice that on this map here, the sons of Ham are in the green areas. So we have Cush, which is modern-day Ethiopia. We have Mizraim. Some translations have Egypt there, and they would have settled in Upper and Lower Egypt. In fact, it's interesting, in Psalm 105, verse 23, plus other texts, Egypt is referred to as the land of Ham. Notice this, Psalm 105, 23, that Israel went into Egypt and sojourned in the land of Ham. The founder of Egypt's first dynasty is said to have been a man named Menes. And some think that's the same as the man we find in the text here as Mizraim. Then we have Put, and we have, which is in modern-day Libya. We have Canaan, the Canaanites. That's gone into detail in that little bit on the side there. We'll look at that in just a minute because Canaan has his own section. We've got Seba, and probably there it is in southern, just south of Egypt. Probably it's the Sabaeans in southern Arabia, or those living around the upper Egypt along the Nile. We have Havilah, even further south there. Possibly means a stretch of sand. In Hebrew, it may be indicating the Arabian desert. So it may be the peoples ended up living over there. We have Sabta. Sabta, the western shore of the Persian Gulf, is where we find this group of people. We have Raama in southwest Arabia, Sabteka towards the Persian Gulf, and we've got Sheba and Dedom, both associated with Arabia, some in the south and some in the north. Nimrod in particular is pointed out. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord there in the land of Shinar. Nimrod's kingdom included Babylon, and the rest of this Babylon area. He also went into Assyria, and mentioned in the text there are Nineveh and other cities that he founded. In fact, we even have a record of Nimrod in an old record called the Jerusalem Targum. And this is what the Jerusalem Targum says about Nimrod. He was powerful in hunting and in wickedness before the Lord, for he was a hunter of the sons of men. And he said to them, "Depart from the judgment of the Lord and adhere to the judgment of Nimrod." Therefore it is said, as Nimrod the strong one, strong in hunting, and is wickedness before the Lord. Henry Morris cited that in his book, The Genesis Record. Nimrod's not given a very good reputation there in the Jerusalem Targum. And it would seem that maybe he acquired his reputation as a hunter by hunting wild animals in the area. And from what we know of the post-flood world, there were many large animals roaming the earth and finally became extinct. We find them in the Ice Age deposits. And anyone able to hunt these great animals would assume the role of a hero and benefactor and acquire a large following. Apparently, the more literal rendering of the Hebrew text in verse 9 of chapter 10 would be that Nimrod was a mighty hunter against the Lord. And that's really, I think, what the Jerusalem Targum is reflecting, indicating possibly that what he was doing was against what God wanted. And that's what the Jerusalem Targum definitely depicts. He very well may have been the leader of the group who began to build Babel, as his kingdom included this place in this area. Kala, mentioned there in the text, has been found and excavated. It's still called Nimrud, Nimrud, after its founder, Nimrod. I think we can see that there. Assyrian legend attributes the founding of Nineveh to a man named Ninus, which would appear to be a form of Nimrod. Mizraim's descendants settled Egypt and its surrounding areas. Mizraim is the Hebrew word for Egypt. Those of his descendants are associated with Egypt and Libya. The Philistines came from Egypt's lines. The Kapharites were from Crete. We can see that most of Israel's enemies were from Ham's lineage. They're listed there in that box on the left-hand side, including the two nations which conquered them, north and south. This was the fulfillment of chapter 9, verses 25 through 26. Israel did conquer all that were in the land of Canaan. Most of these nations are from Canaan and southwards. They're listed there in the text in chapter 10, though not necessarily in Africa. The latter verses do center on Canaan in particular. He's the one to whom that curse was given back in chapter 9. His descendants are mainly those conquered by Israel. We've got Sidon up in Phoenicia, usually linked with Tyre. The Jebusites are mentioned, Jerusalem area. All the rest are inhabitants of Canaan or the area adjacent to it. We also have mentioned in this part of the text, Heth, and some suggest that's possibly the Hittites, or it could simply be the sons of Heth. We're going to see them in the text concerning Abraham at some point in the future. The Sinites may have a link to the Chinese people, as Chinese people have always been identified with the Sino, the Sino prefix, and the name Sin, Sin, as in the geographic, would appear to be preserved in Siang in Chinese, Siang. Also, the very end of this, it gives the extent of the land occupied by the Canaanites. Sidon being the northern boundary, Gerar being the southern region of Canaan, Gaza, the southwestern part of Canaan near the coast, and then on the east, Sodom and Gomorrah, which were. And then we have the sons of Shem. The detail of the direct line all the way to Abraham is given in the next chapter. But Shem is identified as the father of all the children of Eber. He's also identified, and depending on your translation, it's how it's identified. McCord, as well as the King James, those based on the Masoretic text, have Shem, the brother of Japheth, the oldest, which would indicate Japheth was the oldest son. But the ESV translates this, the elder brother of Japheth. The problem here would appear to be word order, which could easily identify Shem as the older brother, or the brother of Japheth the elder, Japheth being the oldest. So whichever it happens to be. So Shem is then either the oldest of the three sons of Noah, with Ham being the youngest. We've had that identified in the text as well in chapter 9. Or Shem was the middle of the three sons, with Japheth being the oldest. Now, the current consensus of translators is that Shem is the oldest. The Net Bible has quite an extensive discussion on this, and they hold that Shem is the eldest. So that very well could be what it is. But Shem is detailed last, even though he's definitely older than at least Ham, and possibly the oldest of the three. He's last because this is the chosen line. This is the one we're going to continue to follow throughout the book of Genesis. Now, Eber, mentioned here in verse 21, actually Shem's great-grandson. Eber is where the term Hebrew comes from. So that's important as well. There he is, Eber. So Shem's sons, in the yellow part on this particular map, we have Elam. Elam lived east of Babylon. That's where the Elamites are. We've got Asher. Asher lived north of Babylon, north of the Assyrians. The Bible says, I know it says about Asher. Asher's the name for the Assyrians. Asher was the region in which Nimrod expanded his power. When names appear in both sections of a genealogical list, it probably means that there were both Hamites and Shemites living in that region in antiquity, especially if the name is a place name. So some of these, there's some overlap of areas in some of these as well. And you can see that here somewhat on the map, because you see some yellow ones up in the north as well as in the south amongst the green and red. Arphaxad was Eber's grandfather, and his descendants were the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, as well as the Jews. We find Lud up there in the north, the Lydians, western Turkey. We find Aram, there it is. The Arameans, or most translations these days, or some translations, the Syrians, from whom we get the Aramaic language. Then we find a chap named Peleg. Peleg is mentioned as one of Eber's son, and the text tells us he was so named because of the division of the earth during his days. And apparently the name Peleg means division. That seems to be a reference to the events at Babel. It would appear that the Hebrew text literally refers to a division in chapter 10, verse 5, as well as in chapter 10, verse 32, although the words are different. Verse 5 and 32 has the word parad, P-A-R-A-D, whereas when you mention Peleg, we've got palag, P-A-L-A-G. But Hebrew authorities indicate that the words are synonymous. The division in these two passages is clearly a linguistic and geographic division. As the division during Peleg's day is in the context of these two verses, it would seem that this is also the division of languages, which occurred at Babel. Henry Morris writes, Nimrod, as Noah's great-grandson through Ham, was in the same generation as Eber, Noah's great-grandson through Shem. Thus, it is reasonable to infer that the division at Babel took place when both Nimrod and Eber were mature men. If Peleg was born soon after the dispersion, it is not surprising that Eber would commemorate such a momentous event in the name of his son. Joktan. His descendants seem to have settled in Arabia, in Yemen, which is there today. And their territory was from Mesha to the hill country in the east, probably near the Red Sea to the Arabian hill country. Shem's descendants, as you can see in the yellow there, mainly settled north and east of Palestine, but some were in the south part of Arabia as well. Main point of these lists in chapter 10 is to show that all nations of the earth came from Noah and his sons. There are a total of 70 nations listed in this table of nations, not counting the Philistines, which most regard as an editorial insertion by Moses. This is not to be taken as a complete exhaustive list of all the nations on the earth, although most can be traced back to these. These are just the ones necessary for the background of the Old Testament, although all the others would fit in here as well. For Israel, this chapter may have served to remind them that they were from the same background as those whose land they were about to possess, and they could easily go the same way that these had gone, and they did. Based on the colophons, which we mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, Shem would be the most probable compiler of the list. We see his signature, his colophon, after the account of Babel. That the detailed persons in Ham and Japheth's line only extend to the third generation may indicate that Shem lost touch with the other branches after the dispersion, and thus didn't have any further information to go on. So hopefully that gives you maybe a little bit of insight into what we have there in chapter 10. In our final lesson, we're going to look at the event that caused the dispersion, well, what we've just been looking at, and that is the Tower of Babel. And then the text at the end of chapter 11 will take us all the way to Abraham. Hope you can join us for our final lesson in this series as well.